One really beautiful and very wise lady in the community here who's studied Vedic science for years sent in a question, or a comment actually earlier today, about wouldn't it be wonderful if during tonight's webinar we could heal the illusion of separation once and for all. I know, why not, right? I mean, our group is very powerful. We have done amazing things in this group, right? We've moved weather patterns around, and we've changed political situations, and we've done like incredible healings for people. So nobody else has tried it, but why not? However, I was looking at it, so I was thinking, okay, you know, I'll try anything. With you guys, I feel brave, right? So as your mouthpiece, I feel brave. But when I looked at it, what I realized is separation is essential. It's an essential component of the way in which wholeness or the creation evolves. It's necessary. Some element of separation is necessary for evolution. So as usual with energy healing, what we're doing, yes, let's heal we're from Bali. Bali is voting to heal the illusion of separation. Yay. So part of that process, and several people are raising their hands too. Part of that process is figuring out which part of separation we need to keep and which part needs to go. From my perspective, put as simply as possible, the part that we keep is the awareness of the essential necessity of separation as an instrument for the manifesting process. Because one unbounded wholeness, the ocean of consciousness unmanifest, becomes the many, right? And so there's going to necessarily be an element of the relationship between the wholeness and the parts, and wholeness and parts, which is the foundation for the illusion of separation. And that's just part of, I mean, we wouldn't be here, we wouldn't be human, there wouldn't be humans, and there wouldn't be stars or galaxies or anything if there weren't for that. So it's got to be there. It's that conscious awareness and recognition and appreciation and sort of reverent honoring of the role of separation as the foundation for the manifested field of creation that is good. That part's good, because when our awareness is seated at that junction between wholeness and the parts, and we see, oh yes, this is how the creation creates, then separation is supporting the evolutionary process. When we become gripped by separation, when we become isolated into our little separate space, and we start to lose, anytime the connection with wholeness is lost, then separation is no good. Does that make sense? Everybody have that? Okay. Yes. Oh, hands raised. All right. Yes. So in relationships, going back to my inner notes, and I'm checking you guys all the time because I have my own intention how I'm going to run, points I'd like to bring out for the webinar, how I'd like to run the webinar. But it's really important that everything that I am when I am here with you is a reflection of your needs and is a reflection of what our healing collective is ready for and wants, etc. So sometimes that really pushes me into new territory, which I absolutely adore. So I'm checking all the time. Just saying. So what I'm feeling is a little energy wave that's going like this. And it's settling from a more gross level of creation down, and settling down into that really fine level where it's oscillating back and forth between wholeness and the parts. And this is us. This is what we're doing. This is the brilliance of our collective, that all of you are able to understand that premise, that we're going down, we're looking deeply into the mechanics and what exactly is happening with that little oscillation between wholeness and the parts. The first thing that arises for me is, if we assume that the principle that the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts, then this creates a natural dominance hierarchy in the relationship between wholeness and parts, right? Because the wholeness, being always greater than the sum of the parts, will always be kind of like the dominating energy or the dominating element, and the parts will be secondary. However, there's another law of nature that counteracts that law of nature. And the other law of nature says that the whole is found in all the parts. And the whole, of course, if we think of the whole as whole, that means that it's not separate. It's not like a piece of the whole that's in all the parts. Like, it's the whole whole. The whole thing is in all the parts. So what it means is that any one of the parts is essentially greater than the sum of all the parts. And that is a paradox. We just stumbled onto something right there, right? So what to do? So I was I'm looking at this principle of these two kind of somewhat opposed laws of nature, or appearing to be opposed laws of nature. And the resolution is that there really is only one wholeness, and all the parts are that wholeness. That really, there is no, the value of separation is essentially an illusion. It's essentially an illusion, and yet it's a necessary illusion. It's a necessary illusion, an illusion which we accept in order to exist. Okay, so here's what's coming. I'm in new territory now, thank you very much. My favorite spot, is that on one level, if we think of ourselves as a spectrum from denser to subtler, and we can also think of right now, I've been last few days or a week or so, I was working with what we call the 8 Prakratis. For those of you who are not familiar, these are considered expressions of nature, expressions of manifestation that go through the 5 basic elements from denser to subtler, right? So space, water, fire, air, and earth, water, fire, air, and space, and then mind, intellect, and ego, making 8. Okay, so some aspects of self necessarily accept the illusion of separation as real in order to support existence. In other words, if we divide up the elements, into the 5, then it's like we have to accept some separation, some difference. There's some difference between water and fire. Really it's a continuum. Really there's a continuum in there. I was learning about these places under the ocean where these intensely hot vents of like magma and fire are coming out under the sea surface. So there are places on Earth that we can find examples of others where there's like kind of a mixing together of the elements. But the point that I'm trying to make is that from the level of experience, from the finest level, from the ego level, yes, I'm seeing. From the ego level, if we define ego as sense of self, okay, we define ego as our sense of self, then from the ego level, it's possible to directly experience wholeness, and everything is wholeness, and everything is complete. Even the parts are wholeness. But the level just above the ego is intellect, and the nature of intellect is to discriminate. So intellect naturally defines differences. So there's a junction right there. And I'm pointing to it with my words and my awareness, because that's where the rubber meets the road regarding our ability to integrate wholeness so completely that even in the throes of the most dynamic expressions of individuality and manifest world and world of diversity and differences, the wholeness is not lost. That's the key, is not to lose the wholeness. Then the separation doesn't grip, but acts as an instrument for evolution. Okay, and not just an instrument for evolution for the individual level of self, but the instrument of evolution for wholeness, like the entire divinity is self-interacting with itself through this whole manifest field for the sake of its own evolution, right? Okay, so into the gap between ego and intellect. And just as I mentioned, those vents that come up under the ocean, where you can get these two seemingly very different elements working together harmoniously and mixing together. Out of the vents, all kinds of minerals come out, and there are little animals in the ocean that eat the minerals, and they're like the first level of the food chain in the ocean. I mean, it's just the most beautiful primordial thing that happens down there in the ocean. Same with us, that in the gap between ego and intellect, there is this wonderful dynamic flow of being. Now, we are breaking new ground. We are breaking new ground. And one of the areas that's up for consideration is a fairly commonly held understanding of ego within the new age non-dual communities as being a bad thing. Ego is bad. Little ego gets us in trouble. Ego is what stops us from evolving, right? I hear this a lot, and I see it a lot because I look to what other people are doing and saying just as much as I need to, in order to understand, to keep my finger on the pulse of the collective. However, if we define ego as sense of self, then sense of self is not something that inhibits evolution. What inhibits evolution, using intellect, here comes intellect, to interface with ego. Intellect says that the aspects of ego that we could say values of ego or byproducts of ego, such as conceit or vanity or selfishness, these types of expressions of ego, these block evolution. Yep, they do. But those are expressions of ego only. They aren't really the essential function. They aren't really the essential component, which is ego. They are byproducts of ego that strayed. Ego, when it strays from its connection to wholeness, then you get selfishness and separation and thinking that looking to that dominance hierarchy, like one is bigger than the other. We already established that in the dominance hierarchy between wholeness and the parts, like there isn't one that's really bigger than the other. And they are absolutely dependent upon each other. Wholeness needs the parts, and the parts need wholeness. And really, it's all wholeness self-interacting. So it's not like one's better than the other or bigger than the other. All right. And this, I'm putting that out there. And the reason I'm putting it out is because it ties into the principle from physics. God bless the physicists. that at quantum levels of creation, we don't see the laws of nature functioning in the way we see them functioning at the surface. At the quantum levels, there are forms that are kind of like folding into each other, and we see the same thing in Vedic science. At the most fundamental levels, at the level of source, when source is just warming up in order to express itself, what we see are angles of understanding of how divinity understands itself that look like they're nestled inside each other, forms that are nestled inside each other, and yet they can nestle this way or they can nestle that way. Something looks like it's inside the other one, but then it can switch, and the first one can be inside the second one, and like that. So at that level, it's more like there's a sort of folding, there's a sort of a churning that takes place at that very, very fine level of creation. So you can't really say, oh, this like dynamism, like the absolute dynamism is somehow bigger than absolute silence, or the fold is bigger than absolute dynamism, absolute silence folding in on each other. You can't say that. It's just, it all just is. It all just is. And what happens when we look to that level and we experience that is, it supports our ability to not be gripped by relative expressions that we have grown up with and that have gotten locked deeply in our DNA from centuries and centuries of humanity evolving on this earth, and for the sake of survival, having to dominate, individuals having to dominate each other. I'm just taking a quiet moment to look in at the DNA and see how far this awakening to the fabulous laws of nature that reside at the quantum, at the deeper levels of creation, how the awakening to these laws of nature can integrate gracefully for the ancestors and thus provide a transformation of DNA for us. Because, of course, the ancestors reside within us at the level of our DNA, and as we do energy healing work for the evolution of the ancestors, so the DNA benefits. So we support a relationship between the DNA and proteins, which exist in our bodies and interact with our DNA in order to produce all variety of effects, including copying, what do they call it, mitosis or meiosis, those layers of when the cells reproduce, and as well as turning on and off various pieces of genetic information, checking in with the DNA, checking in with the ancestors, going back many generations. I'm seeing at least 18 generations. That's a lot of generations. And really, really, it goes back farther than that. Really, it goes the echo effect of the work that we're doing on the most recent 18 generations of our own family echoes back in time much further. Can echo back tens of thousands of years. So I'm just feeling that. I'm looking in at that relationship between DNA and the proteins. And the relationship between DNA and proteins is also a kind of metaphor. It's a kind of representation of wholeness in parts, because the DNA is an expression of wholeness that's present in all the parts, right? It's present in every cell. And so every cell contains that wholeness. And that wholeness interacts with the cell through these proteins. So proteins are like packages of discrimination. They're like discriminating packages of information in our bodies, which delight when I start looking at it. Of course, I'm reading the energy signature. So what I see is there's this bliss in the relationship between the proteins and the DNA. And the proteins are like, oh yeah, here we go. They're like, give me that DNA. It's like their joy, it's a joy to get in there and to play with the DNA, to do what it does. But there's also, what I'm seeing happening is an increase of a sort of reverence, of a reverent love and respect between the DNA and the proteins. Dignity, increase of dignity. There are laws, there are rules by which the proteins interact with the DNA. I'm looking at the laws. Everybody's receiving a download. It's like a rule book, right? It's a rule book with all the rules, all the laws of how the proteins interact with the DNA. Very interesting. So, me telling you what's in the rule book. Remember, the title of today's session is Healing the Relationship with Source. So that's kind of like the primary, healing the relationship with Source. And then that helps to heal all of the relationships. Well, as you all know, those of you who've been with me a long time, know that we found our actions are grounded in or founded upon these subtle structures, these subtle parts in the causal field. So I was looking at this causal ocean of self, this causal level of the physiology. That's the area, for those who are new, that's the area right next to the absolute. It's like the first level of manifestation, the finest level of manifestation. Very abstract, very abstract. And the tide, you've heard me talk about this before, the tide that runs through that level of our physiologies, from wholeness to the parts, and wholeness to back and forth, wholeness and parts, wholeness and parts. And the parts are like malleable puzzle pieces. And as awareness moves out to wholeness and then comes back to parts, we can reform and we can decide, like, oh, I think I'm going to bring a new area of my own causal body into my fine focus, into my center focus. So I was asking being, like, what would be the most useful if you could only bring one area of the causal field of self into fine focus, or if one had to build a system of, like, this would be more useful to focus on, that would be less useful, like what would be the most useful? And what came was this beautiful expression of potential. Beautiful expression potential. So I was looking at this pure, just pristine, clear, white, like brilliant white quality of self. And what I saw of that was that this quality of pure potential resides in all of us. We own it, and we really are soaking in it when we're born, when we're infants. We come into the world infants, and we're just in that pure potential, so in it. So it like so permeates and fills all of what we are. And it doesn't matter how dense or dark an environment a child is born. That potential with which they enter the world shines the light of hope for the future, for everybody, for their family, for everybody. That's why it's such a great celebration when a baby's born. Then it's up to the parents to cultivate, to see, to recognize and identify that potential, and then to cultivate it, to support, at least to provide resources for the child. So that pure potential is an expression of self which seems to be, at this time, to the best of my ability, the closest resonation of the finest level of feeling of the causal body, the closest one to pure being, to pure potential, to pure consciousness, to pure unmanifest being. And it includes the value of transformation, right? Because the nature of pure potential is it fuels the ability to evolve. And it also is very, very close in structure, for those of you who've been with me through other lectures, to the qualities of Agni. Because Agni is the first fire, it's the first light. And Narayana is the Vedic term for that aspect of the causal field, which is present at the transformation, the shift from folding into one's nature deeper, 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 to emerging forward to create the creation. So Narayana sits right at that junction, right at that point where the folding in turns and starts to come out. So we could say that Vedic science has identified this pure potential energy as an animate expression of self and given it the name Narayana. Because really that's that energy that's right there. It's right there before the Big Bang, before it all emerges. It's owned by us. And that quality of consciousness sits in the junction between ourselves and every evolutionary transformation we experience. And it heals and holds a space for our relationship with wholeness, It makes us close to wholeness. When we have that particular quality of self in the center of focus. For a lot of us, when I first discovered it, and so I say for a lot of us, I'm slightly making an assumption there, but I would think that for a lot of people, we haven't really soaked in that feeling for a while, maybe since we were little. As we soak in that feeling in the finest level of expression, this has an activating and enlivening effect for the entire flow of life because it's most prevalent at the moment of birth, which means we're connecting ourselves right now to the moment of birth. And in that connection, we're realigning the entire life's trajectory and according to the evolutionary structure of the whole creation, of wholeness. Because wholeness is moving in that pure potential all the time, right? Wholeness is the source of that energy, and it's the source of every evolutionary or evolving expression in creation, every evolving expression.